Eleanor traced the split rail with a calloused thumb. The wood was sun-bleached and splintering, another thing on a list of things that were giving way. At 42, she felt much the same. The ranch, left to her by Thomas 3 years prior, was a creature of constant, hungry need. Fences sagged, the barn roof had a leak that wept with every rain, and the herd was just large enough to be a burden, but too small to be a proper living. Her life had been pared down to the bone of necessity. Work, eat what she could grow or afford, sleep the dead sleep of the exhausted, and rise to work again. Softness was a memory, a language she no longer spoke. She had stopped looking for her own reflection. Sometimes she would catch it by accident, a fleeting stranger in the murky water of the horse trough, or a ghostly figure in the dark glass of the kitchen window at night. The woman who looked back was not someone she recognized from her youth. The hair that had been a warm brown was now streaked with a decided, unapologetic silver at the temples. The sun of the high plains had etched fine lines around her eyes and mouth, a road map of worries and squinting into the relentless light. Her hands were a man's hands, broad, chapped, with nails bitten down by work, not nerves. There was a stoop to her shoulders that hadn't been there when Thomas was alive. The permanent curve of a body braced against the wind, against loss, against the sheer weight of going on alone. She did not think of herself as a woman anymore, not in the way that mattered. She was a proprietor, a rancher by default, a widow. The word itself felt like a closing door. It designated her as something that had been, not something that was. Men in town, the few who spoke to her beyond a curt nod, did so with a kind of careful, sexless pity. She was Mrs. Parker, Thomas Parker's widow, a fixture of quiet struggle at the edge of town. No one looked at her twice, and she, in turn, had long since stopped expecting it. The desire to be seen, to be wanted, had withered from simple lack of rain. It was a foolishness for young girls with smooth hands and unlined faces. Her world was one of practicality, of survival. There was no room in it for anything else. She had made her peace with that. Or if not peace, a quiet, settled armistice. The silence of her small house was no longer a shock, but the natural sound of her life. From the ridge that marked the edge of his own vast property, Silas Blackwood watched her. He had been watching for months. It had started as a neighborly concern. He'd known Thomas, respected him as a man who worked hard, if not always smart. When he died, Silas had expected the widow to sell up and move back east, or wherever she'd come from. She had not. She had stayed. She had dug in, and he had found himself watching the smoke rise from her chimney on cold mornings, seeing her small figure moving across the fields, her determination a silent rebuke to the harshness of the land. He was not a man given to whimsy. At 38, a widower himself for 5 years, his life was orderly, prosperous, and empty in a way he only acknowledged late at night. The Blackwood Ranch was the largest in the county, a sprawling empire of cattle and grass. He could have had his pick of any number of suitable women, fresh-faced girls from town whose mothers pushed them forward at church socials, their eyes bright with the prospect of his name and his fortune. He'd had no interest. They felt breakable, their laughter too loud, their needs too simple. He wasn't looking for a girl to decorate his house. He was looking for a woman to share it. And he saw one, right there, wrestling with a fence post that outweighed her. He saw the strength in the line of her back, the stubborn set of her jaw. He noticed the small things. The way she'd push a stray wisp of silver-brown hair from her forehead with the back of her wrist, a gesture of weary grace. The concentration in her face as she worked. She was not beautiful in the way of the town girls. Her face had been shaped by life, not sheltered from it. And to him, that was a thing of profound appeal. He had decided, with the same quiet certainty he brought to buying a prize bull, that he wanted to know Eleanor Parker. The knowing had to begin somewhere, and so he nudged his horse forward, manufacturing an excuse as he went. The stray steer was as good as any. He rode down the gentle slope, his presence a deliberate interruption of her solitude, and she had no idea that for him, everything had already changed. He reined in his horse a polite distance from the fence line. "Mrs. Parker." Eleanor straightened up, startled, her hand flying to her chest. She shaded her eyes against the sun, recognizing the horse first, then the man. Silas Blackwood, her powerful, wealthy neighbor. A faint unease settled in her stomach. Men like him didn't pay social calls on women like her without a reason, and the reason was usually land. "Mr. Blackwood?" she answered, her voice a little rough from disuse. "Is something wrong?" "Just checking my lines. Thought I saw one of my steers wander over this way yesterday," he said. The lie was smooth, easy. "You haven't seen a brindle with a notched ear, have you?" "No, I haven't, but I'll keep an eye out." She was formal, guarded. She leaned against the post she'd been setting, trying not to look as tired as she felt. She was acutely aware of her appearance, the sweat stains on her chambray shirt, the dirt smudged on her cheek. He didn't seem to notice. His gaze was calm, steady. It rested on her face, not with the empty pity she was used to, but with a kind of quiet attention she couldn't decipher. "This is hard work for one person," he observed, his eyes moving to the fence. "It has to be done," she said, the words clipped. It felt like a criticism, a confirmation of her inadequacy. "I have a couple of hands who could give you a day on this, if you'd let them," he offered. The offer stung her pride. "I manage, Mr. Blackwood, but thank you." He nodded, accepting her refusal without argument. He lingered, his horse shifting beneath him. The silence stretched, filled only by the buzz of insects in the tall grass. She expected him to turn and leave, his duty as a neighbor done. He did not. He just sat there, watching her. It was the first time in 3 years a man had looked at her with anything other than polite disinterest, and she didn't know what to do with it. She told herself he was assessing the state of her property, calculating how long it would take for her to fail so he could make an offer. It was the only explanation that made any sense. She could not allow herself to imagine any other. A few days later, her milk cow, Daisy, was down in the barn, her breathing shallow and ragged. Jesse, the young man she paid in board and a few dollars a month, stood wringing his hands, his face pale with worry. "I don't know, Mrs. Parker. She won't take water. I think she's got the fever." Eleanor's heart sank. Losing that cow would be more than an inconvenience. It would be a disaster. As she knelt in the hay, stroking the cow's trembling flank, a shadow fell across the wide barn door. It was Silas Blackwood again, leading his horse. "Trouble?" he asked, his voice calm. "My cow," she said, not bothering to hide the strain in her voice. "She's sick." He tied his horse to the rail and came inside, stripping off his riding gloves. The barn suddenly felt smaller, charged with his presence. He moved with an unhurried competence that was both reassuring and unsettling. He knelt beside her, his large frame close to hers in the cramped stall. He ran a practiced hand over the cow's neck and belly, his touch firm and knowing. "Milk fever," he diagnosed after a moment. It happens. We can bring her around. For the next hour, he worked. He sent a stunned Jesse running back to his own ranch for a drenching bottle and a mix of herbs and salts from his stores. While they waited, he spoke to Eleanor in a low, calm voice, explaining what he was doing, what to watch for. She found herself simply following his lead, fetching cloths and cool water, her own panic soothed by his quiet authority. They worked in tandem, a strange and intimate rhythm in the warm, dusty air of the barn. When Jesse returned, Silas administered the drench himself, his movements patient and sure. Afterwards, he stood and stretched, rolling his shoulders. His shirt was streaked with dirt, his hands filthy. Eleanor felt a sudden, sharp awareness of him as a man, not just a wealthy landowner. "I'll fetch you some water to wash," she murmured, turning toward the pump just outside. She brought it back in a metal dipper, her hand trembling slightly as she held it out to him. He took it, his fingers brushing against hers. It was the briefest of contacts, a whisper of touch, but a jolt went through her, sharp and unexpected. She pulled her hand back as if burned. He seemed to notice because he held her gaze for a beat longer than was necessary, his own eyes dark and unreadable. "You work too hard, Eleanor," he said. His voice was pitched low, meant only for her. He used her given name, and it landed with the weight of a stone dropped into a still pond. It wasn't a judgment, not a criticism. It was an observation, spoken with a strange, almost tender gravity. She didn't know how to answer. A flush crept up her neck. "The work is there," she managed, her own voice thin. He drank the water, then handed the dipper back. He walked toward the barn door, and she thought he was leaving. But he stopped in the opening, one hand braced high on the wooden frame, just above her head. He filled the space, blocking the afternoon light. He didn't say anything more. He just stood there for a long, charged moment, looking down at her. The air crackled between them. Then, with a slight nod, he was gone. Eleanor stood frozen in the sudden emptiness of the barn, her heart hammering against her ribs. It was nothing, she told herself. It was the heat, the worry, the closeness of the stall. She had imagined it all. The narrator, watching from a quiet corner of her heart, knew she had not. That night, sleep was a distant country she could not reach. The memory of the barn, of his closeness, played over and over in her mind. The brush of his fingers, the low timbre of his voice saying her name, the way he had stood in the doorway, a silent, looming presence. She tossed in the narrow bed, the sheets tangling around her legs, the familiar silence of the house now feeling loud, expectant. Finally, she gave up, pushing back the quilt and padding barefoot to the small dresser in the corner of her room. She lit the candle on its surface, the small flame chasing the shadows away, and she made herself look, really look. The woman in the clouded mirror was a stranger she knew intimately. She saw the threads of silver at her temples, not as a distinguished touch, but as the stark white flag of surrender to time. She traced the fan of lines at the corner of one eye, the permanent etchings of sun and sorrow. Her mouth, which had once been quick to smile for Thomas, was set in a firm, unyielding line. This was the face of a woman who had endured, not one who invited. Who was she to imagine a man like Silas Blackwood would look at her with anything resembling interest? He was vital, successful, a man in the very center of his life. He was younger than her, by 4 years she knew, though he seemed ageless in his confidence. He could have any woman he wanted. Young women, with skin like cream and futures as wide and open as the plains. Women who could give him sons to inherit his empire. What would he possibly want with her? A tired 42-year-old widow with a failing ranch and hands like worn leather. The thought was so absurd, it was almost laughable. A bitter shame washed over her. She was a fool, a lonely, pathetic fool, building a fantasy out of a moment of kindness. He was a good neighbor, that's all. He had helped her with her cow because he was a decent man, and he likely pitied her. The look, the charged silence. She had invented it all from the fabric of her own desperate loneliness. The realization was a cold, hard stone in her gut. He wasn't seeing a woman. He was seeing a problem to be solved, a charity case. The thought was infinitely more humiliating than his disinterest. She blew out the candle, plunging the room back into darkness. She would not make this mistake again. She would be polite, distant, and above all, sensible. She would armor herself in propriety and gratitude, and she would never, ever let herself imagine such a thing again. Her heart, which had fluttered with a strange, forgotten hope, settled back into its slow, steady, lonely rhythm. A week passed in a blur of hard work and determined avoidance. Eleanor saw Silas riding his fence line once or twice in the distance, but she kept to the house or the far pasture, making sure their paths did not cross. She was formal and brisk with Jessie, her mind a fortress against the memory of that afternoon in the barn. She was succeeding, she thought. She was pushing it all back into the realm of foolish fancy where it belonged. Then the storm came. It blew in from the north without warning, a furious squall of wind and rain that turned the sky a bruised purple gray. The wind howled like a hungry animal, rattling the window panes in their frames and tearing at the shingles on the roof. Jessie had managed to get the stock into the barn just before the heavens opened, and he was safely hunkered down in the small bunkhouse. Eleanor was alone in the main house, listening to the storm rage. She had lit the lamp in the kitchen, the single point of warm, steady light in a world gone wild. The room was her sanctuary, smelling of coffee and wood smoke from the cast-iron stove that fought back the chill. A sudden, frantic pounding on the door made her jump, her heart leaping into her throat. Her first thought was of Jessie, that something had happened at the bunkhouse. She grabbed a heavy iron poker from beside the stove and hurried to the door, her mind racing. "Who is it?" she called out, her voice tight. "Eleanor, it's Silas Blackwood. Let me in." His voice was a low shout, barely audible over the roar of the wind. Relief and a fresh wave of anxiety washed over her. She slid the bolt and pulled the heavy door inward. He stood on her porch, drenched and dripping, his hat soaked and his coat plastered to his broad shoulders. The wind tore at him, whipping his hair across his forehead. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, stunned. "What on earth?" "Tree came down on my line camp shack," he said, stepping inside quickly as she fought to push the door closed against the wind. "I was closer to you than to my own place. Hope you don't mind." It was a perfectly reasonable explanation, plausible, irrefutable. But as he stood there in her small kitchen, water pooling around his boots on the floorboards, it felt like something else entirely. It felt like an invasion, a deliberate act. "Of course not," she said, her voice betraying none of her inner turmoil. She was the polite widow, offering shelter from the storm. "Let me get you a towel. Your coat, too. You can hang it by the stove." He shucked off the heavy, wet coat and handed it to her. For a moment, her hands were full of the damp wool, the scent of rain and horse and him. She hung it on a peg, her back to him, composing herself. She handed him a rough towel from a hook, and he scrubbed at his face and hair. The kitchen was filled with the sounds of the storm outside and his presence inside. The drip of water, the rough rasp of the towel, the quiet sound of his breathing. She busied herself making coffee, her movements stiff and precise. It gave her something to do with her hands, a reason not to look at him. She was intensely aware of him standing by the stove, the heat slowly steaming the damp from his clothes. He wasn't speaking, just watching her. She could feel his gaze on her back, a tangible weight. The small, warm kitchen, usually her refuge, now felt charged and impossibly small. He was too large for the space, his presence overwhelming it, overwhelming her. She poured the coffee into 2 mugs, her hand steady only through sheer force of will. She set one on the table for him, keeping the other cradled in her own hands as a shield. He did not move to take it. He just stood there, by the stove, watching her. Slowly, deliberately, he took a step away from the fire, then another, closing the distance between them until he was standing just a few feet away, by the edge of the counter where she leaned. The silence in the kitchen was a living thing, broken only by the frantic drumming of the rain against the roof. He still hadn't touched his coffee. He was just looking at her, his expression serious, his eyes searching her face in the lamplight. She kept her gaze fixed on the dark liquid in her mug, her knuckles white where she gripped the ceramic. "You shouldn't be alone out here, Eleanor," he said finally, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate in the small space. Her carefully constructed armor of propriety began to crack. She forced a dismissive, brittle sound. "I'm not alone. I have Jessie." It was a weak defense, and they both knew it. "That's not what I mean," he said, his voice softer now but more insistent. She couldn't do this. She couldn't stand here and pretend she didn't feel the pull between them, the dangerous, terrifying current that had been running since that day in the barn. She had to end it. She turned away, setting her mug down with a sharp clink and busying herself with a dishcloth that needed no attention. Her back was to him, a deliberate wall. "Mr. Blackwood," she began, her voice tight and formal. "I appreciate you thinking of my safety, but I think you should go as soon as the rain lets up. It isn't proper for you to be here." Then, the real truth, the one she had clung to in the dark of her room, came out in a mortified whisper. "And I'm too old for these kinds of games." The words hung in the air, a pathetic confession of her own foolishness. She waited for him to agree, to offer a polite apology and retreat. Instead, she heard the soft scuff of his boots on the floorboards behind her. He moved until he was standing directly at her back. He didn't touch her, but she could feel the heat of his body, could feel the air shift and grow thick around her. He placed one large hand flat on the counter beside her hip, the other on the wall just past her shoulder. It was not a prison, but it was a cage of his own making, a gentle, deliberate trapping. She was surrounded by him. Eleanor," he said, his voice so close it was a breath against her hair. "Look at me." Every instinct screamed at her to stay where she was, to keep her face hidden, but his voice held a command it was impossible to disobey. Slowly, her heart pounding a wild rhythm against her ribs, she turned. She had to turn her whole body to face him in the small space he had left her. His face was inches from hers. The lamplight carved shadows into the planes of his face, making his eyes seem darker, deeper. He was looking at her as if he were memorizing every line, every flaw, and in his gaze, she saw no pity. She saw only a stark, unwavering hunger. He lowered his head, his lips almost touching her ear, and he whispered the words that would undo her. The words that answered the deepest, most secret fear of her heart. "You're not too old for me." Time stopped. The rain, the wind, the ticking of the clock on the mantel, it all faded into a distant roar. There was only the warmth of his breath against her skin, the solid presence of his body boxing her in, and those words. They were not a compliment. They were a statement of fact, a claim. He was not refuting an argument. He was correcting a fundamental error in her understanding of the world. All the reasons she had so carefully catalogued in front of her mirror, all her insecurities about her age, her worn hands, her widowed status, they all crumbled to dust in the face of his quiet, absolute certainty. She could not speak. 1,000 protests died on her lips. What could she say? He had seen the truth she kept hidden even from herself. She wanted to be wanted, and he was here, wanting her. He waited, his eyes holding hers, giving her the space to flee or to stay. The choice was hers. After a lifetime of having choices made for her by circumstance, by duty, by loss, this one small, monumental choice was her own, and she chose. With a slow, trembling hand, she lifted it from her side. It seemed to take an eternity. She raised it until her palm rested flat against the solid wall of his chest. She could feel the steady, heavy beat of his heart beneath her hand. It was not an act of passion, but one of surrender, of permission. It was a silent, whispered yes that landed in the space between them with the force of a shout. His own hand came up to cover hers, his fingers lacing through her own, holding her there against him. And in the heart of the storm, in the warmth of her small kitchen, Eleanor Parker finally let herself be chosen. He did not kiss her then. He simply held her gaze for a long moment, as if to seal the silent pact between them, before he leaned down and blew out the lamp. The kitchen was plunged into a soft darkness, illuminated only by the flickering orange glow from the vents of the stove. His hand, still entwined with hers, led her from the room. His boots were quiet on the wooden floors of the hallway, a steady, solid sound in the deep silence of the house. He led her to her bedroom, a place that had been hers and hers alone for 3 long years. The narrator does not follow them past the doorway. The story of what happened next is not told in words, but in the details of the room itself. It is told in the way the single candle on her nightstand burned lower and lower, its flame a lone, dancing witness. It is told in the howl of the wind outside, a wild and fitting chorus to the quiet storm unfolding within. It is told in the sight of his soaked coat, draped over the back of her simple wooden chair, a dark and masculine shape in the feminine space. It is told in the single, soft creak of the old bed frame as it took their combined weight, and then in the profound stillness that followed. There were murmured fragments, his voice a low vibration in the dark, her name spoken like a prayer, her own replies too soft to be words, more like sighs of assent. Later, in the deepest part of the night when the storm had quieted to a gentle, steady drumming on the roof, Eleanor lay awake. She had not known it was possible to feel like this again. She had thought this part of her was a room with a locked door, the key long lost. He had not picked the lock. He had simply built a new door. He slept beside her, a deep and trusting sleep, one heavy arm thrown across her waist, his hand resting possessively on her hip. The weight of it was an anchor, a solid, grounding presence in the dark. She lay perfectly still, afraid to move, afraid to breathe, as if any motion might shatter the fragile reality of the moment. She turned her head on the pillow and studied his face in the sliver of moonlight that cut through a break in the clouds. In sleep, the formidable confidence was softened, the lines of his face relaxed. He was just a man, but he was the man who had seen her. Not the widow, not the struggling rancher, but her. Eleanor, the astonishment of it was a quiet, overwhelming wave inside her chest. To be held like this, to be touched with such reverence, to be wanted not for what she might have been or what she could provide, but for exactly who she was right now. With the silver in her hair and the lines on her face, it felt less like passion and more like a miracle, a quiet, profound, and desperately needed miracle. She watched him breathe, his chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm, and for the first time in years, she did not feel alone in the dark. The first hint of dawn was a pale gray wash against the window pane. It brought with it not the warmth of the new day, but the cold, sharp edge of reality. Eleanor woke slowly, becoming aware first of the warmth at her back, the solid weight of Silas's body curled around hers. The memory of the night rushed in, a warm and bewildering flood. And then, close on its heels, came the panic. It had been a mistake. A moment of madness brought on by a storm and loneliness. For him, a kindness, perhaps, or a simple physical need. For her, a catastrophic lapse in judgment. The cold light of morning made everything clear. She was a fool to think this could be anything more than a single, isolated night. He would wake up, dress, and leave with a polite thank you, and she would be left here, with the memory and the fresh, aching shame of having allowed herself to hope. She would not let that happen. She would not embarrass herself, or him, by acting as if this meant something. Carefully, silently, she slipped from the bed. He stirred, but didn't wake, his arm falling onto the empty space where she had been. She held her breath until his breathing evened out again. She dressed quickly in the chilly air, her fingers fumbling with the buttons on her dress. Her plan was simple. She would be up, dressed, and have coffee on the stove before he woke. She would be Mrs. Parker, the practical widow, thanking him for his help and seeing him on his way. She would be businesslike, untouchable. She would reclaim her solitude before he could hand it back to her. She was at the stove, her back to the bedroom door, when she heard the floorboards creak. She didn't turn around. She focused on the simple, mechanical act of pouring hot water over the coffee grounds, her shoulders tight with tension. He came into the kitchen wearing only his trousers, his feet bare on the wooden floor. He didn't speak. He just stood there watching her, and she knew with a sinking certainty that he saw right through her pathetic charade. He saw the fear, the retreat, the wall she was frantically trying to rebuild between them. He walked toward her, his steps silent. She flinched when his hands landed gently on her shoulders, the warmth of his palms seeping through the thin fabric of her dress. She tried to pull away, a small, involuntary movement of self-preservation. "Eleanor," he said, his voice husky with sleep. He didn't let her go. Instead, he used his grip to turn her around, slowly but inexorably, until she was forced to face him. He looked down at her, his gaze steady and knowing. He saw the doubt in her eyes, the panic she was trying so hard to hide. With one hand, he reached out and took the coffee pot from her trembling fingers, setting it safely down on the stove behind her. Then he cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs stroking gently over her cheekbones. "Good morning," he said softly, and then he leaned down and kissed her. It was not the hungry, urgent kiss of the night before. It was slow, deep, and deliberate, It was a kiss of reassurance, of possession. It was a kiss that said, "This is real. This is not over." It was a statement, a promise, a claim made in the clear, unforgiving light of day. When he finally pulled back, he rested his forehead against hers for a long moment, his eyes still closed. "I'll be back this evening," he said. It was not a question. It was a fact. He was telling her what was going to happen next. He was not giving her the chance to retreat into her fears. He was staying. He was choosing her again in the morning, when all the magic of the night had faded. And as he walked back toward the bedroom to gather his things, Eleanor leaned against the stove, her legs suddenly weak, the carefully built walls of her doubt beginning to crumble into dust. True to his word, Silas returned that evening. He brought with him a haunch of venison and 2 bottles of wine from his own cellar. He didn't ask if he could stay for supper. He simply started preparing it, moving around her kitchen with a quiet, confident familiarity, as if he'd been doing it for years. And he returned the next night, and the one after that. A new rhythm began to establish itself, one that included his deep voice in the evenings and the solid presence of his horse tied outside her barn. Jesse, her young hired hand, saw it all. He was a quiet boy, but observant. He said nothing directly, but one afternoon, as Silas was helping him mend a harness, Eleanor saw Jesse look from Silas to her, a slow, pleased smile spreading across his face. He approved. It was a small thing, but it mattered. The real test came not from within the fragile boundaries of her ranch, but from the world beyond it. She had put off a trip to the mercantile in town for as long as she could, but supplies were running low. She rode in alone, dreading the inevitable questions and the knowing looks. The bell above the door of the general store announced her arrival, and she felt a dozen pairs of eyes turn her way. At the counter was Mrs. Gable, the storekeeper's wife, a woman whose tongue was as sharp as her needles and whose currency was gossip. "Well, Eleanor," Mrs. Gable said, her voice dripping with a sickly, sweet concern that set Eleanor's teeth on edge. "It's been a while. We hear you have a regular visitor out at your place these days." She paused for effect, letting the other customers in the store lean in. A man must get mighty lonely in a big house like Mr. Blackwood's. It's a kindness, what you're doing for him. The implication was as clear as it was cruel. Silas was using her for comfort, for convenience. She was a port in a storm of loneliness, not a destination. The poison of the words seeped into Eleanor's mind, finding fertile ground in her own lingering doubts. She froze, a sack of flour clutched in her hands, her face burning with humiliation. She had no answer. Just then, the bell above the door jingled again. Silas filled the doorway, his presence immediately commanding the attention of the entire store. He had told her he had business in town, but she knew suddenly that he had followed her. His eyes found hers across the room, and he saw the distress on her face. Without a word to anyone else, he walked directly to her side. He took the heavy sack of flour from her hands, and then, in a gesture that was both possessive and profoundly protective, he placed his hand on the small of her back. It was a simple touch, but in the crowded, silent store, it was a public declaration. He turned his gaze to Mrs. Gable, his expression calm, almost placid, but his eyes were as hard as granite. "My house isn't lonely anymore, ma'am," he said, his voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the room. "And neither is Eleanor's." The finality in his tone was absolute. He had drawn a line in the sand, and everyone there knew it. He then turned his full attention back to Eleanor, his expression softening completely. "Did you remember the coffee?" he asked, his voice gentle, as if they were the only two people in the world. He had not raised his voice. He had not caused a scene. He had simply and irrevocably claimed her in front of them all. He had faced down the small, mean friction of the world on her behalf, and had dismissed it as easily as brushing dust from his sleeve. Mrs. Gable was left sputtering, her mouth opening and closing like a fish on a hook. The whispers died. The matter was settled. The seasons turned. Summer bled into a crisp, golden autumn. The leak in the barn roof was fixed. The fences were strong and straight, and there were a dozen new head of cattle in the pasture, all bearing Silas's brand, but living on her land. Her small house had subtly, irrevocably become their home. His shaving razor sat in a mug on the washstand next to her pitcher and basin. A heavy, sheepskin-lined coat, his coat, hung on the peg by the door. On the small parlor table next to her mending basket sat a worn volume of Shakespeare he'd been reading aloud to her in the evenings. The house was no longer silent. It was filled with the low murmur of his voice, the solid tread of his boots, the simple, comforting sounds of a shared life. She was at the stove, stirring a thick beef stew that simmered on the stovetop, the air rich with the scent of herbs and slow-cooked meat. The kitchen was warm, a bulwark against the evening chill that was settling over the valley. The door opened, letting in a gust of cold air, and then he was there, stamping the dust and the chill from his boots on the mat. He didn't speak. He walked across the room, came up behind her as she stood at the stove, and wrapped his arms around her waist. He pulled her back against his chest, resting his chin on her shoulder, and inhaled deeply. "Smells good," he murmured, his breath warm against her neck. She leaned back into his embrace, a simple, unconscious gesture of trust and belonging. It was a movement that spoke of 100 other such evenings, of a comfort so deep it no longer needed to be announced. This was their life now, this quiet, domestic peace. The shock of it, the sheer unlikeliness of it, still sometimes caught her off guard. The woman who had believed herself invisible, past her prime, a relic of a life already lived, was standing here, held in the arms of a man who looked at her as if she were the most essential thing in his world. He hadn't wanted her in spite of her years. He had wanted her, she was beginning to understand, because of them. He had wanted the strength he'd seen in her hands, the resilience carved into the lines of her face. He hadn't needed to rescue her. He had simply wanted to stand beside her. He had wanted a partner, not a project. He turned her head with a gentle pressure of his chin and kissed her temple, a soft, affectionate touch that spoke more loudly than any passionate declaration. His voice, when he spoke again, was a low murmur, meant only for her ears, a tender echo of the words that had changed everything. "See?" he whispered, his lips against her skin. "Not too old." And in the warm, fragrant kitchen, held securely in his arms, Eleanor felt the last stubborn remnants of her old belief finally fall away. She was not too old. She was not too worn. She was simply his, and he hers. The claim, first whispered in a storm, was now spoken in the steady, quiet light of every day.